Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am so delighted to welcome you all and to welcome the television audience today to the latest episode of our Tuesday with a Scholar, Ollie Speaks series. Today we are welcoming Professor Leslie Morris of the University of Minnesota, who will be talking on a topic that has become tragically relevant over the last 2 weeks, really less than 2 weeks. She's talking, of course, on Kristallnacht. This is the 80th anniversary of the Jewish victimization by the Nazis preceding World War II. In order to make this episode possible, there's a couple of sources that I need to thank. First of all, our long-term partners. We could not do this without the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. They are our great partners. We don't have an Ollie representative here today, but it's a very worthwhile organization if anybody's thinking about joining it. And then Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, which came into being as the result of the Legacy Amendment in 2008, which is the financial sponsor of all these programs. We are very much indebted to them. I see a sea of red I voted buttons in the audience. I'm delighted to see that. But if there's anybody who has not voted, let me be the last nagging voice that you hear. Please go out and vote, but directly after you hear Professor Morris. So thank you very much. I'll turn the podium over to Leslie Morris.
Well, thank you, Judy, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this very dreary day. I'm also very grateful that the technology worked. We live in the era when we're so dependent on technology, and some of us are more adept at it. I just literally flew here from campus where I was hooked up very precariously, I might add, to both Helsinki and a university in Germany, and we were trying to have a three-way seminar, and needless to say, it didn't entirely work that well. So I am relieved that at least my slides come. So before I launch into what I had originally planned to talk with you today, and that will clarify this, I hope, enigmatic image on the first slide that I'm sure many of you noticed and have been scratching your heads. What in the world is this? And I will get to that. Initially, when Judy invited me, I thought what I would do, and this is many months ago, long before Pittsburgh. Now we think of Pittsburgh as a demarcation point, unfortunately, in the history of this country. So long before Pittsburgh, about 6 or 8 months ago when I was first invited, I thought what I would do was take you on a tour of interesting Jewish memorial sites in Germany with a focus on Berlin, but not exclusively Berlin, since this is in part my area of research. So just a bit of background, though. I am a professor of German literature with a specialization in German Jewish literature, 1945 to the present. I also serve as the founding director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota. And somehow those two facts of my professional and scholarly life have found a particular resonance, of course, in the last few weeks, in the last 10 days or so since Pittsburgh took place. So I thought I would actually frame some comments in order to have us all be able to think about the repercussions of historical anti-Semitism and racism, and what it means then to turn our attention, as I will be doing with you, to the ways in which Germany has really become a world leader in thinking about how to memorialize and how to remember a very complicated and very dark past. Germany, as many of you know, really has become, since I would say since the 1970s in particular, the European country that has modeled a way of coming to terms with its past, the German term, which my students love to see written out on the blackboard because it takes the entire length of the blackboard, the Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Before I begin, I want to ask, though, how many of you have been to Germany or have been to Berlin? Okay. And how many of you have been there before 1989, before the wall came down? Good, I'm glad to see that. So I think my comments will be interesting both to those of you who were there before as well as to those who have only been there after the fall of the wall. So on the subject of Pittsburgh, and I would say more generally the state of this country, I found myself as an American Jew who, with one non-native, non-American parent, my mother survived the war in France, my father was American. I found myself an English major for many reasons. And yet, in 1980, when I graduated from college, I left for Germany. At the time, I really was one of a handful of American Jews who felt somehow pulled to Germany, and again, with no German family connection, and at the time, I didn't quite even know what my own family's Holocaust history was. I subsequently have learned quite a bit more, but no direct connection to Germany. And what fascinates me is the way in which, in the intervening 30 to 40 years, the memory of the Shoah, the commemoration of the Holocaust, has gone on to take new shapes and forms in Germany and is in a very interesting conversation with work being done in this country in particular. So this has become one of the main areas that I write about, that I research about, and that is the ways in which memory circulates between Germany and the United States. To that end, let me just say a few words then about Pittsburgh and where we find ourselves at this moment in this country. When Pittsburgh happened, it struck me immediately that much of the press coverage, and I'm sure that you saw, that we were all watching more or less the same press coverage, focused on anti-Semitism as a religious phenomenon. And what I want to make clear, and this is, I think, where the lessons of Germany can really guide us in the most profound and important way, what I want to make clear is that while there is certainly centuries and centuries of religious, theological-based anti-Semitism throughout Europe, what becomes important, I think, at this moment in time is to understand that in Europe, since the mid to late 19th century, Jews became a racialized category. And so, as many of you know, the Nazis did not object to the practice of Judaism. This was not a sort of Latter-day Crusades, but rather Jews were deemed a racial category, and on the basis of this racialized nature were to be exterminated. And so I just would like to remind us all that the terrorist, the killer, the person who committed the acts of murder in Pittsburgh 10 days ago, was motivated by a racialized hatred. And I also think we need to remember as well that 2 days before he did that, another person with similar worldviews of white supremacy tried to enter an African American church. When he couldn't get in because the doors were locked, he went looking, he went hunting in a sense, and killed 2 African Americans. These 2 events, I really do believe, need to be understood as part of one larger picture. And I think it's always very important not to see anti-Semitism in particular as part of a discourse or a worldview of exceptionalism, but rather to understand it in this particular context of racism. Racism and anti-Semitism are 2 sides, unfortunately, of the very same and very ugly coin. To that end, I also would like to remind everybody, in case you hadn't yet seen it, because it is an important local story. So I'd like to begin here locally, well, not in Roseville actually, but in Minneapolis, but close enough, before I take us on our tour of some interesting sites of memory in Berlin and in Germany. So as many of you know, that by the 1930s, the 20s and 30s, Minneapolis had the unfortunate distinction of being understood to be the most virulently anti-Semitic city in the United States. And about a year and a half ago, my colleague at the University of Minnesota, now retired Professor Emerita Revelin Prell, this is, I suppose, what happens when one retires. I haven't yet achieved that. Finding herself with some time on her hands, started digging around in the archives and started uncovering some remarkable documents about the legacy of the University of Minnesota. How many of you were able to visit Anderson Library last fall when the exhibit that she curated went up? It was called A Campus Divided, and it told the story of segregated housing and anti-Semitism at the University of Minnesota in the years 1930 to 1942. Pivotal years as well, of course, for European history. For those of you who missed the exhibit, there is an online version. There's a digital version that you can look at. And what is extraordinary is, again, to remember that what was happening in Germany at the time was also certainly finding its own tentacles in certain corners in this country. So while we, of course, have a very different national narrative vis-a-vis National Socialism and fascism, we were the good guys, there were certainly things happening in this country, and in particular here in the state of Minnesota. And right now at the U, after I leave here, I will be running back to campus where I'm part of a commission to study what to do about this very complex history. Because, in fact, Lotus Kaufman, who was then president of the university and really the architect of segregated housing, forbidding African American students to move into the dorms and in effect then not to be able to study at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota was the last university in the Big Ten and in the North to uphold segregated housing. And I think this story is so vital to hear, and I think it's really important to reflect on that on this particular day, or this week, I should say, of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht itself will be on Friday, on November 9th. But what this exhibit uncovers and what we're right now in the process of grappling with on campus as in the aftermath of the many important documents that Professor Prell was able to locate is the fact that not only were the policies of segregated housing and explicit and quite brutal treatment of African American students enacted, but simultaneously Jewish students were targeted by the administration, in particular by one Dean Nicholson. Now, I'm sure in here we have graduates of the U, or those of you, raise your hands. All right, very good. It's always nice to see. And, you know, as director of the Center for Jewish Studies, my office as Director of Jewish Studies is in Nicholson Hall. So when the dean on this committee asked, you know, we're dividing up who is in charge of which building as we contemplate how to transform this history into something productive, I said, I must do Nicholson. I feel I am. And my other office in German is in Falwell Hall, an unblemished name. So far as we know, you know, the thing we've learned, you start digging and all sorts of things come out. But nonetheless, this particular history is the reminder, however, of the ways in which we cannot talk in this country of anti-Semitism without also grappling with the legacy and the enduring racism, as the events last week in Pittsburgh and Kentucky demonstrated. And similarly, at the University of Minnesota, as Dean Nicholson was doing President Kaufman's bidding and making sure dormitories remained segregated so that African American nurses were not allowed to sit in the same classes with their fellow students and so forth. At the same time, Dean Nicholson was doing his special activity of choice, and that was conducting surveillance on Jewish students and keeping files of Jewish students whom he suspected of being campus radicals, communists, and so on. It was a very complex moment. The University of Minnesota was not by any means the only university to have this sort of legacy of racism and anti-Semitism. And yet what's interesting to me is the fact that this really has only surfaced in this sort of sustained and detailed way in the last 2 years. So I urge all of you. You're here today because you're interested in learning about Kristallnacht, the legacy of fascism and National Socialism, and because it's everywhere in the press right now, the nagging question of what is happening to our democracy, and is there a resonance of the past? In 2016, for the very first time, I was teaching a large lecture class on the Holocaust to undergraduates at the university. And it happened to coincide with this new administration. And at the time, this is early January of 2016, so or 2017 rather. At the time, the press was filled with comparisons, and the question in the headlines that you undoubtedly saw, is this 1933? Is this 1938? My answer at the time to my students was, no, you need to create always historical specificity. Don't immediately go to that place, of that it's all about to happen again. And yet, I would say, after Pittsburgh, we are at a very different place. And this is truly not only for American Jews. This was by far the worst attack in our history, in the history of this nation, on American Jews, as the outpouring of support and the interfaith dialogue and the vigils and the coming together of so many different peoples after Pittsburgh demonstrates. I really think, however, in that regard as well, this is not 1933. I think that there is an awareness and a desire to learn and to be able to move past that. So I'm sure we can come back to this in the conversation. I am not a political scientist. I'm also not a historian. I am a literary critic, a literary scholar who's interested in the ways in which literature, film, art, cultural products can shape the imagination and, I would also hope, give us a way into a better future. And so I'm sure these questions, and I'll be very interested to hear from you in the questions and answers. So, Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is commemorated along with many other events from the National Socialist era in Germany with great gusto, I would say. I know that on Friday throughout Germany there will be vigils, there will be religious services, there will be gatherings in front of synagogues and in front of former places of Jewish, where Jews once lived, and there will be important speeches. And it has entered into the public sphere in Germany in a way that I think is very important and needs to continue. The other thing I want to say, though, about Kristallnacht, because often people forget this, November 9th, 1938 is a date that resonates with a number of other moments in German history in which things happened on November 9th. It was no accident that what we sometimes also refer to as the pogrom, the Jewish pogrom, Judy referred to the victimization. And I'm going to be coming back later to this question of, are Jews victims? And what does it mean then to reclaim agency over a very problematic and complex narrative? German Jews, as I'm sure many of you in the room know, German Jews were among the most highly assimilated of Jews in Europe, so assimilated that they identified as Germans. And this becomes, of course, one of the great ironies and tragedies of the war, that these were the people who felt that they were so aligned with Germany. Many of them had fought the men had fought in the First World War. I've heard stories in families of people, of Jewish families, where the grandfather had even received the Cross of Honor from the German government for their service in World War I. And so they thought, why in the world would anybody want to expel us? They were so deeply a part of German culture, and yet, of course, as you know, ultimately they weren't. And I want to come back then to this question of Jews as a racialized category. It did not matter if your family had converted to Protestantism or to Catholicism in the 19th century, as thousands of German Jews did. There were large numbers of conversions from Judaism to Catholicism in the south, largely Protestantism in the north of Germany in the late 19th century. And yet it was not, again, a matter of what religious community you belonged to, but rather Jews were understood to be a race, and it did not matter however many baptisms you had had in your family, it did not matter. But the only thing that counted was blood lineage. So November 9th resonates. November 9th, 1923 was also the date, for instance, of the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, the failed putsch. And of course, most famously, November 9th, 1989 is the date most clearly associated with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening between East and West, although that process had actually already begun, but it really came to a culmination very significantly on November 9th as a way to demarcate the end of the Cold War. I was living in Germany at the time, and I can tell you stories about that later. Some of the images I'm going to show you are pictures and images of some memorial projects that I took at the time. But let me now take you through a few of these sites. Some of them might be familiar to you. What I've tried to do here is to introduce you to some very interesting memorial projects that you might not have come across. And so this first image, I'm going to leave it enigmatic for now, and you'll see why, but keep it in your mind. So this first one is something that perhaps some of you who've been to Germany or even Europe, since these so-called Stolpersteine, the stumbling stone project, there are now tens of thousands of these. How many of you have come across these as you've been traveling throughout Europe? And it was a wonderful project that was initially designed to simply mark the houses, the spaces where Jewish families had lived in Germany. And so these copper or metal plaques are inserted into the ground. So quite literally, the person walking through the city on his or her way to the grocery store literally stumbles into history, stumbles across the narrative of a family who had been living there. And with that is forced into the memory without consciously setting out to have to think about it. When we think, for instance, of going to a museum or a memorial, you know in advance that you're about to engage with the past. The idea of the artists who created this project was to catch people off guard, to remind them that the spaces in which they're taking their kids to school and walking their dogs and going to the grocery store and doing all of those mundane things are the exact same spaces where people who were murdered in the Nazi genocide of the Jews also once upon a time went about their business. So I see this as an interesting memorial project. And it's interesting to me as well, it begins in Germany. It was such a German project. It's so German that the German term for it gets carried still in the other European countries where you will find these stones. So here you can see, I don't know if you can read it, but it just lists the name, the birth date, the death date, or whatever other information is known. Some of these stones, of course, quite tragically, we don't have much information. This one simply says this is where a woman by the name of Violetta Krause lived, and that she was born in 1931, deported in 1943 to Auschwitz, and died on August 22nd of 1943. So there's some information, but they take all different forms, and I think as well that the variation there is important. They're all similar in terms of form and the basic idea of conveying information, but each one, of course, as each life and each death and each deportation was different, conveys different forms. So here's another example. So this is not a Jewish memorial. This is the Brandenburg Gate. This is I think, arguably the symbol of German nationalism from the 19th century. It is the edifice in Berlin that became the symbol in 1989 for the redivided Germany, since it sits right at the end of the street of Unter den Linden and was one of the demarcation points between East and West. So here you see it in this form, neoclassical. It's actually modeled. Here's its origins and so on. So it is certainly, I would say, if not the most iconic place in all of Germany and all of Berlin. It's up there, along with a few others that I'll show you. So about 10 years ago, oh gosh, now it's more like 14 years ago, Stephen Feinstein, who was my friend and colleague, the former director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, he died, unfortunately, very young, about 6 years ago. Stephen Feinstein brought this very interesting German artist, Horst Heysel, here to the Twin Cities. We were fortunate to be able to host him. And Heysel caught my attention for a number of reasons. In the early 1990s, after the wall came down, the city of Berlin embarked on the project of creating a Holocaust monument in Berlin. There wasn't one yet. And so they did what all city planners do and who want to commission artwork. They put out a call and had artists submit proposals for this call. This ultimately ends up being the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe that I'll show you a picture of. But for about 10 years, the city of Berlin, the artists, thinkers, writers, everyday people engaged in a 10-year-long debate about how and also if to commemorate the Holocaust. I would argue, and I have argued this, that in fact, the debate itself became the memorial in many ways. There was so much wonderful public discussion about how can we actually capture this with any one piece of art or any one place? And the question as well, doesn't creating a memorial then stop then the ongoing reflection with which Germans by that point in time, by the 90s, had really already been deeply engaged in? So that went on for about 10 years. And Horst Heysel, in the first run, when they asked for artists to submit proposals, he submitted a proposal that consisted of the following. He proposed blowing up the Brandenburg Gate, and you can see here, and he did computer simulations. To his mind, the Brandenburg Gate, with its iconic representation of German nationalism that, in many historians' eyes, leads directly to National Socialism. They trace that line from Bismarck to Hitler. There are many theories about this. Did this come out of nowhere, or is it part of a larger process of nationalism? In fact, Heisel's idea was that the Brandenburg Gate is single-handedly, obviously not literally, responsible for National Socialism, for fascism, but in fact, it needs to be blown up, and the memory of it, and here's another image, he did computer simulations, you can see there the remaining columns that would be there. In his view, to blow it up would be the fitting monument and memorial to the Holocaust. So needless to say, he was eliminated in round one, which was, of course, no surprise to him either. And again, I think it's important to say how the discussion that he sparked becomes then part of that really interesting debate. But then in 1998, on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in January, he did do another project, and this one was realized. The Brandenburg Gate, of course, never did get blown up. It is still intact. But what he did was to do a projection of Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free, from the gates of Auschwitz. He did a laser video projection. In other words, in a sense, making the same claim that his project to blow up the Brandenburg Gate had made, and that is creating a sort of palimpsest between the edifice of the Brandenburg Gate and the gates of Auschwitz. In other words, making that visual statement that this, in fact, cannot be separated, that these two events cannot be separated. And he received the permission, since he's a very dutiful artist, he did receive the permission of the city of Berlin to have this projection up for one night. The city officials who gave the permission were the only people who knew this was going to happen. The media didn't know. And so again, people are strolling through. They're going out to dinner, to the movies, or whatever they were doing, and walking down the street and looked up and are again confronted with this history. So it is a kind of art that is political art, certainly, a kind of in-your-face art that forces a confrontation. And we can talk about that. Is this effective? What would a similar thing be in the United States? Here's another. These are just some more shots of it that you can see. I'm sorry, it was in 97. I said 98. All we have left here is the photo documentation of the event. It has never been done since then. All right. So another iconic building, the Reichstag in Berlin. And just to give you another example, this is Christo, the artist who has a tendency to wrap large things. I don't know if he's ever done anything in the Twin Cities. Does anyone know? I've only lived here for 19 years, so as long as I've lived here, Christo has not. He should wrap Kaufman Union. That would be, there we go. I'll suggest that today. Anyway, here's Christo's wrapping of the Reichstag, and here's another image of it. I just wanted to include that. So here we finally have the monument that was finally built after the 10 years of debate and discussion. Peter Eisenman, who is actually an American Jew but with some German family background, was the one who won. His proposal won. And how many of you have been to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe? And significantly, it is always referred to as the Holocaust Memorial. Eisenman and the other artists and historians who were part of this project felt very, very strongly that it is not the Holocaust monument, and it is not just about Germany, but rather all of Europe. So it is the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. It's sort of a mouthful, even more so in German. I'm not going to burden you with that one. But it's become very controversial, as some of you might know, that as it was going up, or soon after it came up, it was discovered that the company that manufactured the product that they had used to prohibit graffiti from being from staying on the stones turned out to be the same company that had manufactured Cyclone B. And so, yet again, the past, as I tell my students all the time, the past is never past. The past comes back in traces, and this is yet one more example. That caused a large stir. They found another company. There is no graffiti. But here's another. These are just images I've taken. It's really impossible. I'm not a photographer by any means. It's very difficult, though, to capture the scope of it, and also the fact that these 2,700 steel columns, but they're not exactly columns, they're steel pillars, sort of, are of varying length and size, so that when you walk through it, very interesting things happen acoustically. Noise bounces off and refracts. And here's another one. You can see here, it is just adjacent to the Reichstag. It's right there in the distance. And this is absolutely significant, right around the corner from the newly built and newly relocated American embassy. So when the capital moved back to Berlin from Bonn, where it had been throughout in West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, the particular site of the American embassy is, I think, extremely important to keep in mind. It is also right next door, it's right adjacent as well to the Brandenburg Gate. So we have here a very interesting sort of memory district in a way, with the American Embassy playing an enormous role, almost sort of watching over it. And writers and German thinkers have also reflected on how the post-war presence of American troops, as Germany, as Berlin, we were one of the occupying powers in Berlin, continues in a sense to hover, but as a sort of protective, in a protective role now. Here's another image just to show you some more. So now that you've seen that, 2 years ago, an Israeli artist who is living in Berlin. Berlin, by the way, right now has the largest population of Israelis who live outside of Israel. I mean, there are more Israelis in Israel, but Germany and Berlin in particular has a large, large number, and in particular of artists. I would say the artistic avant-garde in Berlin is largely Israeli, and Shahak Shapira is a lesser known one, but the project was very interesting because in the press for about the last 8 to 10 years, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about whether or not the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe should become a place where people can have a picnic on a sunny day, and should children skip around and jump from stone to stone as kids do, and when young couples walk on a date and hold hands or kiss. In other words, what should the function of this public space be? And there's, of course, divided opinion. There's some who say, and Peter Eisenman, by the way, the architect of this, is of the belief that this is actually lived space. It is not a museum. It is not to be kept behind walls and not used. And so people will use space as people will use space, and children will play as children will play. Shahak Shapiro, though, fell more on the side of that this was somehow sacrilegious, and did an interesting project you can see here. And some of these are videos, but that's beyond my technical capability, so I've just given you some stills here. But counterposing people, and people do yoga, by the way, on these. So someone in a yoga pose, and then showing that same exact pose, but with images of bodies. Very, again, iconic Holocaust images of mass graves and bodies and so on. Just to drive home the point you see here more clearly, I mean, the point that what these people are doing is nonetheless still in the ruins of history, and that we can never forget the past. So I'm going to just quickly show you a few images. These are actually from other cities, from Stuttgart and from London. And if you can recall for a moment, so because I'm not going to be able to go all the way back to the projection that Horst Heysel did on the Brandenburg Gate of the Arbeit macht frei. He was by no means the first artist to think about creating that palimpsest of history onto architectural space. In the 70s, when the whole question of NATO on German soil was a hotly debated topic. This is when I first lived in Germany in the early 1980s. This really was the question for Germany, grappling with its own Cold War legacy and whether or not the Pershing missiles belonged on German soil. This was part of the movement of younger Germans to demilitarize because of their own history. And so there was a lot of opposition to NATO. And so this artist, who was actually a Polish artist, did a number of these projections onto different spaces. And here, this is most provocative because it's also important for us to remember that in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and continuing on, it is forbidden to display the swastika. It is a crime to display the swastika in any way. Until the advent of the internet, it was also impossible, it was also illegal to buy a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. the internet, of course, changed everything because you can get anything from anywhere now. And there is actually now a very interesting and important annotated, very heavily annotated new version of Mein Kampf that has been released with historians, with multiple essays by historians, and understanding it as the historical document that it is. Now, that is, of course, very different from those who would want to somehow valorize this as a Bible, right, to go through. So this is one of my favorite, though, of these projects. Shimon Ati is an Israeli, also living in Berlin. He has been there, though, since the 1990s. And he did the first important memory project starting in 1992. He called it The Writing on the Wall. And what it was a series of projections of photographs from the 1920s onto these new sites of what is now understood to be the Jewish district in Berlin. For those of you who've been to Berlin recently, this is the place where the synagogue, the rebuilt synagogue, the main Jewish quarter in Berlin, the so-called Scheunenviertel, which in the 1920s was the place where many Jews from Eastern Europe had immigrated to. In the 1920s, around a little later, but still around the time when many Jews were fleeing pogroms and fleeing life in Eastern Europe, which is what brought many to this country, my own grandfather, to Duluth, actually, before I just remembered that when I moved to Minnesota. I'm from Chicago. The story was it was too cold. He went south, all the way south to Chicago. But there were masses and masses of Eastern European Jews who were in Berlin in the 1920s. They were very different from the very Western German Jews, who, again, were assimilated, educated, part of the educated middle class. And the Eastern European Jews were religious. They looked different. They spoke Yiddish, not German, and so on. And this was the district in which they lived. This was in East Berlin. This is important because now when one goes to Berlin, for those of you who weren't there before 1989, it's very easy to forget that this was a truly divided city. This Jewish quarter was in East Berlin and was not at all tended to by the East Berlin city officials. It was in complete disrepair. There was very little or hardly any commemoration of Jewish life in East Germany at all. The narrative was that they had been the victims, they were the communist victims, and there was very little desire actually to engage with that particular past. So what Shimon Ati did in 1992, this is 3 years after the fall of the wall. I was living in Berlin at the time, soon after, and it was still truly a divided city, even though you could still now pass from east to west. But the vestiges of the war, the vestiges of the Cold War were still there. It has taken decades now for those traces to be erased. They're not fully erased. They're there if you look for them, and I'll show you another project in a minute that demonstrates that. But what he did in 1992 was then to do another one of these photographic projections where he took old pictures from the Jews who had lived in that quarter in the 1920s, and he projected them onto the wall, again, to make the point that the present in which we live, or 1992, is still suffused with the past, that the past is not over, and the quality isn't good. You can see in one of these, I can't even see if it's this one. One of them has the word in German. It was the Jewish butcher shop in that district, so he projects it onto this space. What I find interesting now, in the year 2018, and this was not the case in 1992, if you were to stand right now on the street corner where this is taken, where he did this projection, you would see a Starbucks, you would see a very fancy shoe store, You would also see a very, high-end, very fancy bagel shop, since that's all the rage in Germany right now. And you would see extremely expensive, I think it is the most expensive real estate in all of Berlin. And so in 1992, though, you can see here that it is still marked as very much East German space. So I find that interesting, too, I've been teaching and looking at these images now since the 90s, and now that moment of it being part of East Germany becomes another trace of the past, almost a kind of nostalgia for some. Here's another image. You see a scribe. I don't know if you can make it out. It's pretty small, but you can see that was a scribe standing in his bookstore, and here's another image, and so on. All right. So this is one of my favorite projects, partially because it's so completely overlooked. I'm always interested in finding those memorials that are tucked away and that go almost unnoticed, and yet were the work of an artist who wanted to call attention to the memory. This is from a part of Berlin that had been the garment district, in effect, which was Jewish in the 20s and the 30s. Until the wall. It's a small little neighborhood. You wouldn't even notice it. And the subway stop, as you're going, again, I don't know if you can see this, but as you're going up the stairs out of the subway, he simply did a somewhat analogous project to the Stumbling Stones, writing the names of the people who had lived in that district when they had been born, when they lived there, and when they died, wherever the information is known. I am almost certain that most people going out of that subway stop, going back home after work, don't even necessarily see it. But it's there, and it's there along with the countless other sites of memory in Germany. Here's another image here. You can see it a little more carefully, a little more closely here. It's one among many. So this is an interesting project that an American artist who has done a lot of work in Berlin, she's an American Jewish artist named Susan Hillard, did. She called it the J Street Project, J standing for Jewish. In Germany, in the Middle Ages, very often in small villages and towns where Jews lived, by the way, throughout Germany and throughout Europe, not just in the urban centers, there would be what would be called either a Judengasse or Judenplatz, simply Jewish street. And she went throughout Germany locating the vestiges of those street names and photographing, and in part it was to remind everybody that Berlin, there are places in Germany other than Berlin. We sometimes forget because there is so many memorial projects in Berlin. So this is one example. She took pictures. Here's one from the former East. This was also done at that time in transition, in which names of streets, if they had been East German, became marked out with red. So, for instance, Linden Street in East Berlin for a while had two different placards, as it was sort of in transition, until it was finally changed. And then, before I get back to my beginning image, I'll tell you about one more interesting project. There's a neighborhood in what had been West Berlin. It is completely an everyday neighborhood. There's nothing terribly interesting. It's a residential neighborhood. Tourists don't go there, but it's a comfortable neighborhood. And in the 1990s, two artists who we also had brought to the U and who did a show at the Walker, in the late 90s, early 2000s, Renate Stie and Friede Schnuck, did an interesting project in this very, today, sort of overlooked neighborhood, which had been a very largely Jewish, very bourgeois neighborhood where the Jewish middle class lived. They took a series of street signs and edicts that the National Socialists had put up demarcating rules and regulations for Jews. So as you know, Jews were no longer allowed to own property, and there were a number of other ones. And they put them up, they got the permission of the city to have this up for, I think it was initially just supposed to be a week. So that in very bureaucratic, National Socialist, Nazi bureaucratic language, you could see it is forbidden for Jews to sit on this bench. It is everything was forbidden. They put them up all around the main square of this neighborhood, which is right where the subway stop is, where everybody in the neighborhood walks. And then documented people's reactions. So again, you have people going out in the morning to go to work, and they look up, if they look up, and they're confronted with a particular kind of historical bureaucratic language that has largely been excised, or there's been a lot of conscious attention to altering the German language, so that those vestiges of National Socialism, of so-called Nazi German, have been eradicated. And what's interesting is that the city ultimately decided to keep the project up. So the next time you're in Berlin, I urge everybody to go to it. It's a really interesting project. And again, I'm almost certain that there are people who walk past this every day and don't even notice it, which was part of the intention of the artist. You either notice it or you don't. It's there, and it's there to be understood and thought of. So the final stop on our tour is an interesting site I discovered in 2007. I was in Berlin for the summer. I was actually teaching at the Humboldt University, now houses the Leo Beck Institute. Leo Beck was the prominent German Jewish rabbi who we now have in New York, the Leo Beck Institute. It's one of the main bodies for scholarly work, historical work on German Jewry. And I was teaching in Berlin at the Leo Beck, a summer course, and I was wandering around in a neighborhood that borders where the wall had been. For those of you who've been to Berlin, you probably have seen there are still some traces, some places where they kept parts of the wall still intact as a memorial, and other places where they removed it, but it's still on the ground. You can still sort of trace where it had been. It doesn't rise up out of the ground, but you can trace it. So I was walking, and I discovered an interesting place because I realized that what it was doing was exhibiting art. It was, it turns out, what was called the Sculpture Park. And it was a provisional space that 5 artists, one of them an American Jew, the others were all Germans, had decided to appropriate. It was in the hands at the time of real estate speculators, but this land was just sort of there. From the building by the great German Jewish architect Erich Mendelsohn, and this was the Mossy Publishing House building. So it was one of the big German Jewish publishing families in Berlin. Designed Mount Zion Temple in St. Paul. He then was a refugee. He had to leave Germany and did a number of really important synagogue and other places of public spaces in this country. And Mount Zion, which he built in 1951, was one of his last projects before he died. But he was a towering genius of among European architects, and you can see here this modernist design here. It's very interesting. I love that we live in a city that has an Erich Mendelsohn building. If you look, by the way, at the aerial views of Mount Zion, where I don't know if any of you were at the vigil last Monday night at Mount Zion. There were 3,000 people there. You wouldn't actually know if you're just walking in the building, but if you look at an aerial view, it is the only building that is not rectilinear on Summit Avenue, and it was very much part of his modernist intervention of creating skewed lines and having things not fit into the mold. And you can see a little bit of that in this building. At any rate, this building is across the street. Here's another view of it. And right around the corner from that, this is another memorial I literally stumbled across. This is designed by two Israeli artists and architects, and it is in the courtyard of what had been the Linden Strasse synagogue that was destroyed in Kristallnacht. So again, to come back to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Jewish businesses and synagogues throughout Germany were destroyed, and that synagogue was destroyed and had been in ruins. This was in East Berlin, and the architects did a project that recalls the pews or the seats of a synagogue. It is now the courtyard of an insurance company. And so as I was taking these pictures, because the windows of the people who work in the insurance company are they face into this courtyard where people like me come and take pictures and distract them from doing their work for the insurance agency. But again, it's one more example of these many projects. So the sculpture garden that's just adjacent to all of this, and which I discovered because, and now we come to the enigma explained. So this was actually part of an art installation in 2007. This is done by a Hungarian artist and is a Jewish star. I was in Berlin the whole summer, and I have a series of photographs because, in fact, as the summer went on, the weeds grew taller and taller, and eventually, but I was walking down the street, and first I saw this red, and I couldn't figure out what it was, and I was quite taken. But it's there as a reminder, and it's there changing in time and space. So some more images here of this space. There was a fence that you had to push in. Here it is, to actually gain entry into it. And then an artist who we also had here to campus a number of years ago did an interesting project. In 2008, the Palace of the Republic, which was the large edifice in East Berlin that was a combination community center, bowling alley, shops. It was an enormous structure that took up 2 or 3 city blocks and was really an iconic building in East Berlin during the German Democratic Republic. It had been the palace in the 19th century. It had a long and storied history. This artist discovered that 5 trees had sprouted spontaneously on top of the Palace of the Republic. And as the building was about to be demolished, it was set to be torn down. She got the permission of the city of Berlin. Here is a photo of it from the times of East Berlin. You can see the cars there, the Trabants, and so on. She got the permission of the city to stop the demolition for one day, and she took the 5 trees that had sprouted on top of the building, and she replanted them in, hold on, these are out of order, excuse me. She replanted them, they're actually here. Not that you can actually identify them, but they are there. She replanted them in the sculpture garden. And then, 6 months later, she did another art project. She wanted to bring the trees to West Berlin, to the main art museum, which is a Mies van der Rohe. He was the architect for this contemporary art museum in West Berlin. She wanted the trees to migrate from the east to the west. but was unable to bring them. And so what you see here is a facsimile drawing of the trees. Here they are. This is the most, certainly the most well-known of modern art museums in Germany. And then here they are back in the sculpture park. Some more pictures here. She has labeled them. And then, finally, hold on, let me, finally, her last project, which was never realized either, she wanted to bring the trees to the United States. She christened them. She decided that these were what she called her palace tree refugees. And like German Jews, many of whom had settled near Los Angeles in Pacific Palisades, all the well-known Jewish intellectuals and philosophers, Thomas Mann and Theodor Adorno and Leon Feuchtwanger, were all in Pacific Palisades. And so she decided to think of her trees as these rootless cosmopolitans, as I like to think of them now, and to bring them to the United States. Those of you who've traveled internationally, as you know, you cannot even bring a sprig of parsley without, so needless to say, she did not get the permission. But the idea was to think about the ways in which history, both in Germany and the United States, is always in a series and in a cycle of being rethought and reshaped, transformed, that you cannot think about the history of East Germany without simultaneously thinking about the Cold War in West Germany and the United States. And so her tree refugee project remains still a conceptual art project. She has written about it and so on. But I think have now some time for questions, and I think I'll just open it.
We do have time for questions, and I'm going to bring the mic.
Please tell us about November 9th, the actual Kristallnacht.
Well, from all of the accounts that we have, it was an absolutely terrifying, for Jews and also for other people, destruction. It was an orchestrated, it was not just an ad hoc thing. And as I said, the key really is the very fact that it happened on November 9th. So this came from on high and is the reminder as well how anti-Semitism and this sort of act, and again, to bring this back to Pittsburgh, when things can begin small, and then they escalate. So the accounts, and there are many historical accounts of eyewitnesses of what that was like to then wake up. But the number of synagogues that were destroyed not every single one was. Some were more destroyed, some have been rebuilt. Others, such as in the monument that I showed you in the courtyard of the insurance company, that one was completely destroyed. There was absolutely nothing left. So it was just an empty space that they were able to then build something out of. So I think that it signifies as a demarcation point, certainly. 1938, November 9th, 1938, there had already for 3 years, the Nuremberg laws had been in effect already for 3 years, decreeing who was Jewish, and with those scales of how much Aryan blood you had and so on and so forth. But November 9th, 1938 really does mark a turning point in many ways, and I think that's one of the reasons why it is so very important to commemorate and to keep talking about.
This gentleman has a question.
Yes.
I'm John Mons. Thank you so much, Dr. Morris, for this. This is important. We in this country tend to write revisionist history right and left. We're in the middle of it. these memorials are a way to keep it in front of our face. Is there revisionist history going on in Germany about this period?
So I would say not on the level of the state, not the official. As you know, beginning with the Marshall Plan and going on really still with Angela Merkel, Germany has been consistent about creating a public inquiry into their past. I also think that it's important to keep in mind several other events along with Kristallnacht as part of this keeping alive the awareness and not enabling a revisionism. I mean, there are, of course, fringe groups, conspiracy theories. I mean, that's not unique to Germany, and it's not unique to the United States. That's, of course, everywhere. But what's interesting to me is that in those immediate years right after the war, there was very little public debate and discussion in Germany, although you still had, in the 1960s, for instance, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. In 1965, where Nazis were put on trial. This comes after the Nuremberg trials. And right after 1961, when Adolf Eichmann is captured, put on trial in Israel, and Hannah Arendt writes her magnificent piece of work called Eichmann in Jerusalem, about the banality of evil. This becomes part of the public debate about the Holocaust, and yet there really was still not that much attention. This all changes, however, in 1979. In 1979, the U.S., the American miniseries Holocaust, airs on German television. And this becomes the pivotal thing that changes everything in the public sphere, was the miniseries Holocaust. For the very first time, it entered into the living rooms, quite literally, of Germans. The statistics for how many German families sat and watched, it was a dubbed version into German, watched this miniseries, I think that it's in 8 parts, Holocaust, is legendary. It was well over 70%. And so it had a tremendous impact. And then we have the next really large public event was 1985, when then President Reagan visits Germany with Chancellor Kohl, makes a visit to the military cemetery of Bitburg, which is where the German military had been buried, and does not go to a concentration camp. And that Reagan does not visit a concentration camp, but visits the cemetery of the SS. This sparked an enormous debate and controversy in Germany, and outrage, and a desire for the world to really enable them to engage with their past. And then there are a series of other events, public events, that really shaped this. So I would say that no, certainly the German government is so deeply committed to doing this work that they really have become a model. By the way, as we in this country have been engaging with the history, for instance, of the Confederate statues at some other universities and so on, many of these universities have been bringing in experts from Germany to engage with, well, how does one look at one's own very dark and complicated history? So I would say on a public level, no. And again, it's actually illegal. So, in Germany, that is, so.
Question over here.
Professor Morris, could you provide a bit of a broader context for the Jewish population in Germany, and especially Berlin, and the fact, my understanding is that there are less than 500,000 Jews, German Jews, of the 6 million who were, 6 million, whatever the figure you want to use, but that in Berlin, they were so limited that Goebbels even had to choose the highest ranking Jew in Berlin at the time was Bernhard Weiss. And he made a joke about the vice president of police. But there weren't very many Jews, and so it was a targeted and what we'd call today fake news. Okay, could you talk about some of those numbers?
Okay. Well, yes. So actually, the number usually that's cited, 1933, there were 501,000. So just over 500,000. You're correct, which was less than 1%. It was about 0.75% of the general population, which I think is an important figure to keep in mind. Largely centered, however, in urban areas: Frankfurt, Berlin, Hamburg. Somewhat lesser extent in Munich, certainly. But to your point about the fake news, by which you mean, can you clarify exactly what you meant?
It's made up that Jews are taking over, like immigrants are going to take
All right.
over
Yeah.
the U.S.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes. No. Absolutely. And I think that this is also something that we saw again with the Pittsburgh. This particular person, the killer, and who was also tied, by the way, to the same white supremacist group that did the Charlottesville, which is part of the Charlottesville in front of the synagogue was, "Jews will not replace us." This old anti-Semitic trope, this canard that Jews run the world, that Jews are more powerful than they really are. Unfortunately, in many other times in history, but you're absolutely correct that both the number of Jews and their actual influence did not match this perception that they had more power. And I find it always so interesting that there is this perception of Jewish power, or that white supremacist sort of the mantra, right, that they are always singing. So yes, so thank you for that. I think you're absolutely correct.
Now this gentleman has a question.
So two points and then a question. One point, when you're talking about the history of the university, I think during that period of anti-Semitism and stuff, you also had a very vibrant study of eugenics that were going on, which was about trying to develop a pure race and ties in. And had a, excuse me, a very visceral experience from that. And yet today, he endorsed being healthy and being the right track, and that's incredibly frightening. And then I guess the question, the
steel columns. A number of people have asked the artist, and he's been very resistant. So one theory that I've heard is that there are apparently 2,700 pages in the Babylonian Talmud. And so this actually is, I don't know if this is its own kind of conspiracy theory. So that's what he was really thinking about. But let me just mention another project that hasn't yet been realized, but a performance artist who lives in Berlin has wanted to take 27 live Jews, people living park there. There would be space for 2,700 people to do something. But the question of the space, I think it was that he had a certain amount of physical space to work with, and in fact, that is the number that came up. But I'm not sure that there is actual significance to it. But it is, I want to say though, that the scale of it is breathtaking. I think that part of the power of that memorial is the space. Also, I want to say, very much tied to what you see with the steel columns that I didn't, because I couldn't show you, is that underground, underneath, you go below, and there's a very important and really well done historical documentation center where you really can learn the history in a really beautifully done and very thoughtful, that links, again, Germany with all of Europe. It's really trying to make that argument that while this was engineered by the Germans, it could not have happened without the cooperation, of course, of the others. So.
We have a question here, and then I'll bring the mic to the other gentleman.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for particularly I was impressed by the distinction you made between racism and religious objections. Even though it's pretty obvious, I had never thought about it that way, so thank you for that. But I have another question. It's pretty evident that the official Germany has a very clear position, but can you comment on what do you think the underlying dynamics in the population, as opposed to, Angela Merkel and the government?
Okay. That's an important question, and there have been studies done trying to perhaps to challenge the official line. The official line is very strongly aligned with Israel, as you know, and has done everything they can to combat anti-Semitism. Angela Merkel, I'm sure you've seen this in the press, but Merkel herself has said the reason why she let in 1 million refugees, the Syrian refugees, is precisely that this is still part of that act of atonement as a German. Very much the official line. I have seen studies that ask people, so what do you really think, though? And, those are, I would say, somewhat less rosy a picture. I've also seen similar studies about anti-Semitism in this country and racism. So I'm not a social scientist, so it's a little harder for me as well to evaluate those kinds of studies. I still really do believe that teaching and reading and learning and being as informed, which is the democratic ideal in this country. And also, again, I just having this be able to circulate, in the press is important. I think that the fact that Germany has these punishments actually for engaging either in revisionist or contrary to fact history, to displaying the swastika, the very fact that there are legal structures in place to prohibit that, I still do believe, and I feel we need to believe that then does have an impact on the psyche of the nation. But it's very complex. And I just came back. I was at Washington University this past weekend at a big Holocaust conference, and I was in a seminar with a group of scholars. They were the children and the grandchildren of SS people, of the perpetrators, and some were, like me, American Jews whose my father was also fought in the Second World War, and then some Germans. And so it was a very interesting group. And the Germans in the group, and now these are all third generation, these were people in their 30s and 40s, but they are still grappling with what it means to have had grandparents who harbored these kinds of anti-Semitic beliefs. It's very hard to fully excise, and I think it's harder just thinking on a national scale. So thank you for that. I share your yeah, it's,
This gentleman has a question.
yes.
Yeah, if you'll forgive me for asking you to digress, based on your thinking about these issues, do you have any comments about our problems here with Confederate memorials and Native American remembrances also?
Well, as I said, when I leave here at 3 o'clock, I'll be with President Kaler and the group of people who are trying to figure this out precisely. In our case, it's not the Confederate monuments, but rather our own particular history here in Minnesota. I think it's very complicated, and I do believe that the Holocaust, while not an exceptional case, can really help to point us in ethical and structural ways to thinking about these broader questions. And I know that's why I've been asked to serve on this particular committee, because of my own research in the Holocaust. The question of the very fact that the University of Minnesota was on Native land. And when you look at the campus in Morris, University of Minnesota Morris, all students of Native American ancestry are given free, don't pay tuition. And I think that there is a way in which this is beginning to enter into the larger consciousness in many ways in this country. And it's, I think, also happening at a particular moment when these questions become particularly urgent in many ways. So,
This gentleman.
I believe that fear is the base. Non-Jewish people historically been frightened by the Jews to incite that racism. Why should I be afraid of you? What is there about the Jewish people that is bringing about this continued for centuries racism?
that is the subject of a wonderful seminar that my colleague at the U teaches. It is so, I mean, it is the question in many ways.
Who is your colleague?
Bruno Schwat teaches, through the French department, teaches the history of anti-Semitism. Also in the history department, you can take courses with Daniel Schrader, who also teaches about Israel and also the legacies of anti-Semitism. It is an enormous question. I agree with you about fear. Absolutely. There are some historians who would make the economic argument that it is, that it's always, at times, if you trace, and I've seen some of these charts, if you trace spikes in anti-Semitism in particular, and this is a little different actually from racism, it corresponds somehow with moments of greatest economic insecurity. So this is, of course, also one of the explanations for the rise of Hitler, right? It was, after the inflation of 23, it was also the, deep economic insecurities, and I think that also, to a certain extent, matches up with some of what we've seen going on in our country. When people feel something is being taken from them, I think it's somehow behind that chant of the white supremacists in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. It is somehow, but I think it is a skewed, it is a projection. This is another way to understand it. It has also been understood by psychologists and social psychologists as a projection of one's own greatest fears of elimination and so on, that you need to then always have the scapegoat and so on. I also think that, on the flip side, there is sometimes the Jewish explanation for it is, and there's been actually quite a lot of work done in recent years about this, the fact, that however many number of Nobel Prize winners have been Jews, and the predominance of Jews in certain fields, music, science are the two that generally get cited. Now this becomes a very tricky sort of, then you're falling into the very, very problematic and tricky realm of genetics and so on, and if there is a sort of racial superiority or inferiority. But I do think that part of that, while it is an uncomfortable and, a sort of unpopular thing right now to engage with, in part though fuels precisely what you have articulated. I think that's there as well, that fear. So it's, it is it's complex, and it is the reminder, though, Pittsburgh and what happened, and so many of us never thought in our lifetime that we would see this, having heard stories from our parents, my mother in the war, and my father, in this country, what they experienced. It's shocking, and yet at the same time, it isn't. In that anti-Semitism did not just happen. It just did not start with Pittsburgh. It was always there in this country, in the same way that racism has not ended with the civil rights movement, and we know that, and we see it periodically, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Because Professor Morris has another appointment, I think we're going to really try to end this at 2:30. We have time for just one more question, and I think it'll have to be brief.
With respect to what you just said, I'm reminded of Umberto Eco's the need for an enemy to project all the bad things on to consolidate power in one's own group. But what I wanted to ask you was the question of the news, the press. What happened after Kristallnacht, and are we doing anything different now?
Well, thank you for that question, because I think, in fact, if there are parallels to draw between this moment that we find ourselves in now and the 1930s in Germany, it is precisely the freedom of the press that has been identified, and not just by me. This is certainly how a number of key thinkers right now are thinking about it. It is that it was absolutely the freedom of the press went, and with that, a whole other series of events were able to take place. And I think that questions of First Amendment and freedom of the press, which are the very bedrock of our democracy, of any democratic country, are perhaps, again, looking back to history, precisely where we need to keep our eye on the 1930s in Germany and the moment. So thank you for that.
And thank you, Professor Morris.